Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I know that we are supposed to start our class at 9, but since I have many students having a problem with time, and I also have a problem with the time that we choose, and we cannot agree on a specific time, so I decided to record the lecture and send it to you so you can watch it at any time you want, and that will be the best option for this. So let's get started. Today we are going to talk about uh, the British literature in the 19th century. Okay. Now, the first thing that you have to understand in the British literature in the 19th century is that um, there are certain events that affected British literature in the 19th century. One of these events is the American Declaration of Independence in 1760 or 76 1776. uh, that's the first events that affected literature in the 19th century. Another event which is very important in the 19th century, or before the 19th century, in fact, was the French Revolution. The French Revolution is another also, great event that, shaped the way people think and affected, people largely, especially when it comes to the idea of democracy, because the French Revolution led to the end of the French monarchy and the transformation of France from being a monarchy and a kingdom into being a republic. And so instead of having a king, now you have a president or an elected president. So these events should be taken into consideration when we think of the British literature in the 19th century and the Romantic literature in particular. The second thing that I want to highlight is uh, is okay. So the second thing that I want to highlight is that the 18th century, which is the age that came before the 19th century or before the Romantic period, okay, was called the Age of Reason. Why we call it the Age of Reason? Because they depended on science, they depended on knowledge, they depended on the mind, and even literature at that time was very technical and scientific, very highly elevated, difficult, and it focused on the on the city and the society rather than the country or the or nature in general. So as I said, it's called the Age of Reason because science was the most important thing, and reason or what we call the human craft. So they were human crafts at that time that make literature or meant that period called the Age of Reason, or the age of thinking, and the age of science and discoveries in general. Okay, now Romantic period. So if we go here, um, sorry. So if we go here to the second page, okay, here's the second page. Here's the Romantic period. The Romantic period, as you can see here, it started in 17. Oh, okay. That this is like roughly or rough date here, from 1780 or 98 to 1832. Now, why this date? We choose this date, the Romantic period, because it shows the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So 1798 up until 1832. I think this date is chosen because of the publication of the Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Coleridge. Now, the publication of the Lyrical Ballads is important because it shows, or they declared the main or the manifesto of the Romantic period. All right, so I don't know if I can type here, yeah, let me put it here, the lyrical ballad by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Okay. All right. So this is the date 1798 when the Lyrical Ballads was published and was created by, sorry, by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, today these are the objectives of the lesson. So today we are going to trace the political and philosophical roots of Romanticism. We will compare and contrast new Classicism and Romanticism. We will also define the characteristics of Romanticism, and we will explain the significance of Wordsworth's Coleridge Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1789. And that's why, as you can see here, why we choose this date. It is because of the Lyrical Ballads was published at that time. And also, we will list, define, and give examples of typical forms of Romantic literature. So simply, we will talk about the Romantic literature. Now, the first thing that we will start with is the roots of Romanticism. Now, if you look at the picture here, you will see trees, river, sheep, beautiful castle or a house or whatever it is, a bridge. All these elements, compose the romantic, a view, the romantic sense, because Romanticism in the end has to do with the with nature, or the importance of nature. Okay, so here let's get started, and let's start defining the romantic or the roots of Romantic literature. Often the term Romantic literature, particularly poetry, evokes the connotation of nature poetry. So some people call it nature poetry here, nature poetry. Although nature is an important component in much Romantic literature, Romanticism is much more than recording the beauty of natural world. Romanticism, and here this is very important, certainly is not what the modern readers usually think of when they hear the words romance or romantic. Romanticism does not refer to romantic love. So simply, in the modern time nowadays, if you ask someone what does romantic mean, they always link it with romantic love, but that's not true. When we talk about Romanticism or the Romantic period, here we talk about the fascination with nature and with its elements. And now we will get to the definition of Romanticism. First of all, here we have Romanticism. It grew from a profound change in the way people in the Western world perceive their place and purpose in life. Even events such as the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 and the Industrial Revolution restructured society and the way individuals view themselves and their relationship to each other and to the social order. And if you remember, I talked about these events before. If you remember, uh, I mentioned I mentioned I mentioned uh, Romanticism and how it was influenced by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution here, it refers to the increase or the expansion of industries in all regards. In the 19th century, we have the invention of machines, and we have also the invention of railroads. And this, made an industrial revolution that influenced the way people think and the way the people live. And so these are three events that should be taken into account when understanding the Romantic period. Now, let's look at the. Okay, I think I got something. Here you go. Yes. Here, if you look at this definition, democracy. Now, democracy is very important for Romanticism. Why democracy is important? Because remember, the revolutions that happened before, such as the French and the American revolutions, were about democracies. They want to, end the monarchy or the kingdom, and they want to have a republic where the president is the most important thing, not the king. Here in the late 18th century and in early 19th century, the concepts such as the great chain of being, which had long represented the way humans thought of themselves and their roles in society, crumbled in the wake of new ideas about democracy. Rather than placing themselves above or below other individuals in the hierarchy, people began to believe that all men are created equal. So here, this is very important. That's the part of the democracy here. Okay. So people believe that they are equal. Although it took more than time to be accepted, the idea that women and people of color are also created equal germinated in the fertile environment of the democratic deals. So simply, democracy, and here we have to explain what we mean by the great chain of being. The great chain of being here refers to the fact that there is an order in society. So the order starts with the king, and then the people of royal family, and then the people of high rank, and then the middle class or the rich class, the middle class, and then the lower class or the workers, and finally the peasants or the people who work in farms. So this is a great chain of being, some going from up to down. With the democracy, they disbelieve or they rejected, the great chain of being, and they started thinking about, how everyone is equal and that we are created equally, and there's no distinction between people. Okay, the nature and spirits. Nature and spirit. European philosophers such as Rosset and Spinoza maintain that innocence and the potential for human goodness are found in nature. Again, these are some of the important, terms that you have to know, that innocence and the potential for human goodness can be found in nature. Human institutions such as governments produce pride, greed, and inequality. Thus, nature and people are close to nature become the ideal for the Romantic writers. So here, if you look at this paragraph, we have the human institution and we have nature. Now, nature is something, positive, and it shows the goodness of human beings, while human institutions such as the government or religion or, any kind of institution, what they produce pride, greed, and inequality. So we have here nature versus society. Nature shows goodness, society shows greed, pride, and inequality. Thus, nature and people close to nature become the ideal for the Romantic writers. Now, nature takes an additional significance with the idea of the philosophers such as Schelling, who posed an identity of mind and nature. And here, Schelling says here, nature is visible spirit. For poets such as Wordsworth and Coleridge, nature, and these are, romantic poets, some of the famous romantic poets, romantic poets, Wordsworth and Coleridge, nature is a source of divine revelation and visible veil through which God may discern. So it's a source of divine revelation. So simply, nature for these poets is God or is religion, okay? And through nature, they can reach God. For these writers or for others such as Shelley, nature is the means to tapping into the collective power of human mind. So here Shelley, another third romantic writer, believes that, nature is the road to collective power of human mind. So through nature we can reach to the best of our human mind, to imagination and emotions. What American writer Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to as the oversoul. Nature is the source of human innocence and goodness because nature is manifestation of the divine. So why nature is important here? It is because it is a source of human innocence and it is also a source of goodness. And because of that, the divine or the religious aspect of nature, comes out or appears. Okay, for Romantic writers, then, the source of poetry is not a conscious crafting of lines of certain number of syllables in a certain metrical pattern, rhyme scheme like the 18th century heroic couplets. Instead, the literature is a source of, here we have to continue the next page, but here, literature is a source of inspiration, and that comes from connecting through nature with the divine or the transcendental properties of a human mind. So simply, if you look at the previous age and how they created poetry, poetry in the 18th century, the previous age, the age of reason, poetry was a craft. It means that it was a profession. They create meters, rhyme, rhythm. Everything was crafty. But for the Romantic writers, poetry was not a craft. Poetry was an inspiration, something that comes to you, something that is, that comes to you naturally without, any complication, without any difficulty. And here, Romantic writers use the term imagination. And that's why, imagination has nothing to do with craft. Imagination to refer to this connection. The power of God to create nature is parallel to the powers to create through imagination. And this is very important also, that the Romantic poets believe that the Romantic poet is a god. Why is a god? Why he or she is a god? Because they are able to create, like God is able to create nature, and the poet is able to create nature through his poetry and through his imagination. So simply, the Romantic poet is a god through imagination. In defense of poetry, by Percy Shelley, this is another Romantic writer, uh, states that the imagination strips the veil of familiarity from the world and lays bare the naked and sleeping beauty, which is the spirit of its forms. In his lines composed a few miles above the Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth writes of emotion and spirit that impels and all thinking things. So here again, we focus on spirits, on imagination, inspiration. All these words are of a great importance to Romanticism and nature. The next one, which is here, is there is something called Sturm and the Drang. This is a German term. This is taken from Germany. Okay, so in Germany, in fact, Romanticism started first in Germany, and then it spread to other European countries. Let me read here. On the facets of Romanticism, one facet of Romanticism also recognizes the darker side of human mind. Uh, Originating in Germany, the Sturm und Drang, usually translated as storm and stress, movement pictures an anti-hero, a character dark in appearance, mood, and thought, in rebellion against the restriction of society. So, if you remember before, we talked about the difference between nature and culture, nature and the government, nature and society. Nature refers to goodness, society refers to evil, greed, and pride, if you remember that. Anna Radcliffe and others wrote Gothic novels that typically feature picturesque. Uh, okay, Anna Radcliffe and others wrote Gothic novels that typically feature picturesque yet haunted medieval castles and ruins, supernatural elements, death, madness, and terror. So, and again, we talk about imagination, we talk about inspiration, we talk about emotions, and now we have another element of Romanticism, which is the Gothic novels. The Gothic novels are part of the Romantic movement. And what do we mean by Gothic novels? Is that they are focusing on haunted medieval castles, ruins, supernatural elements, death, madness, and terror. So simply they deal with something that is horrible, something that has to do with terror, such as death, such as killing, murder, castles, ruins, supernatural elements, ghosts, jinnis, all these crazy stuff, madness, terror, death. These are part of the Gothic novels. And Gothic novels is again is a reflection of the romantic period. Gothic elements appear in many romantic works. Heathcliff and the Ghost of Catherine, here again, Ghost of Catherine. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and the Mad Wife, Madness, and the Mad Wife in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. All these are examples of how the Gothic is part of the romantic movement. And here, instead of having a hero, here we have anti-hero, because traditionally we have the hero who comes and saves his people, etc. and etc. But in a romantic period we have the anti-hero, the hero who is very scary, very horrible, and there are crazy stuff that happens in the novel. Okay. Romanticism. Romanticism is a reaction against many facets of New Classicism. The following chart lists a contrasted view of New Classicism and Romanticism. This is a very good chart because it distinguishes between Romanticism and the previous age, the Age of Reason, or New Classicism, the 18th century, اللي هي في المادة اسمها ما بين القرنين. Okay. Now, New Classicism use an imitation of literary tradition from ancient Greece and Rome. So simply they imitate ancient Greece and Rome. It's an imitation, okay? See the difference here. Romanticism use an imitation of literary tradition from the Middle Age, including the medieval romance. So instead of going to Greek and Rome, they go to the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages, by the way, was not that far from a Romanticism. But Greek and ancient Rome, that was very far. So that's why, this is called New Classicism or Classicism, because they go to the classic works of Greece and Rome. While Romanticism is called Romantic because it goes to the Middle Ages, where they used to have castles, where they used to have forts, and they were used to have crazy, stories of ghosts and jinnis and stuff. Now, New Classicism here, the beauty is in structure and order. So in their literature, there is a structure and order. And we said that literature is a sort of craft. Okay, it's a sort of craft. So literature is a craft. It's a craft for them. But in Romanticism, beauty in organic natural form. So simply the idea here is in nature. Nature is the source. So there's no craft, but there is like a natural thing that comes to the poet, and through this natural thing that you can create your own poetry. New Classicism also, they suggest or they emphasize that art from applying order to nature. So simply the word order is here and there. It is always mentioned here, the word order. While in Romanticism, it's inspiration here. So the keyword here, inspiration, here the keyword is order. Last thing, in Romanticism, they have the heroic couplets, and this is one of the types of poems in the 18th century. While in Romanticism or the 19th century, we have the lyrical poetry. Lyrical because it's simple, it is spontaneous, it is inspirational, it comes from the emotions, and it's not complicated as the heroic couplets or as the new classicist literature. Okay, let's continue the distinction. Now, new classicism focuses on the external people. They focus on the external people and the events. So simply, it is they focus on society, like the group. Now, Romanticism focuses on self-expression of the artist. So they simply focus on the artist himself or on the individual. They focus on the individual here. Okay, on the individual. Okay, so here on the society, here on the individual. Now, New Classicism, they believe in the great chain of being, and you remember the great chain of being, the king, the royal people, the rich people, the middle class, the lower class, etc. But in Romanticism, they believe in democracy, and democracy here refers to the republic. And remember, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all these, end the British or end the monarchy or the kingdom or the rule of the kingdom in these countries. So these countries are democratic because they choose their presidents. The president or the president does not come by birth, by choice. The New Classicism focuses on reason. This focuses on mysticism. Double check this word, mysticism. It means that that has something that has to do with the spirit, spiritual. Yeah. Reason leads to spiritual revelation. So here the emphasis on reason. Here nature leads to spiritual revelation. See the difference here. Reason, nature. Reason, nature. Okay. And then we have urban glorifies civilization and technological progress. So here they focus on the urban, means that they focus on culture and society. Here in Romanticism, they focus on the rural. So rural here refers to the country and sees the evil of civilization and technological process. So for them, for Romanticism, civilization is something that is evil. Culture is something that is evil. And technology and industrial progress is something evil. In the opposite side, for New Classicism, urban is something positive. Civilization, they glorify civilization and technological progress. Now, New Classicism, values wit and sophistication, and that's why their poetry and literature in general is so difficult. It's very sophisticated. But Romanticism, their literature is very primitive and simple. Why primitive and simple? Remember, because it has to do with democracy. Because in democracy, literature should be read by everyone. It has to be very simple and reflect the people. But in New Classicism, literature is sophisticated and does not reflect the whole society, because New Classicism is not a democratic literature. But in Romanticism, literature is democratic. Human nature needs artificial restraints of society, whereas restraints of society result in tyranny and oppression. So here, restraint means like the control of society. And in New Classicism, they believe that there must be some kind of control over society. But in Romanticism, they said that restraint of society or the control of society will result in tyranny and oppression. It means that it will result in rulers who will oppress, who will do violence to their people. And the last thing, and this is very funny because this is New Classicism referred to the head, reason, and here it refers to the heart, emotions. So this is reasonable reason, this is emotions, this is science, this is nature, etc. Now, characteristics of Romantic literature. Here it is. We have some kind of characteristics here. First of all, medievalism. Medievalism refers to, okay, rather than looking for forms and subject matters from classical literatures, Romantic era writers prefer nostalgic views of the Middle Ages as simple, less complicated, not troubled by the complexity and decisive issues of industrialization and urbanizations. So here, medievalism, they refer to the Middle Ages. So they talk about England, but England like 200 or 300 years ago. So 200 or 300 years ago, that was not, very old. But in New Classicism, they go to the Greek and Roman history, which is so far and different from the culture in England. So, and that's why, Romantic poets focus on medievalism or the medieval or the Middle Ages of England. Second, mysticism. Romantic mysticism is the belief that the physical world of nature is a revelation of a spiritual and transcendental presence in the universe. Mysticism is not the pantheism, worshipping nature. Romantic writers would not worship a tree, but the spiritual sublime elements manifested by the tree. Romantic literature, particularly poetry, is often characterized as nature poetry. Mysticism explains the events love of nature. Romantic writers love nature not only for its beauty, but primarily because it's an expression of spirituality and imagination. So simply here, mysticism refers to the fact that nature will lead you to God. Nature will lead you to the spirit or the spiritual. And that's the part of mysticism. So without nature, we will not reach to the spiritual side of the world. But one thing that you have to understand is that romantic mysticism does not believe that they worship nature. They don't worship nature, but they think that nature will lead us to the spiritual world. Nature will lead us to the highest, level of human spirituality. The third, sensibility. When Jane Austen titled her novel Sense and Sensibility, she sets up the dichotomy between rationalism and the emotion, enthusiasm that was a reaction, often an exaggerated reaction to the reason and logic prized in New Classicism. So again, remember, sensibility has to do with emotions, emotions, and emotions is the opposite of reason. And that's why, Romanticism is a reaction or is a rejection or a refusal uh, to the previous age, which is the age of reason. Okay, so let's go to the next page. The last thing here, primitivism, and individualism, arising from two sources: philosophical theories that posit innocence is found in nature and the ideas of democracy. Romanticism values the primitive individual, the person who does not have the artificial manner of high society, the cultivated facade of the ar- aristocracy. Sorry. Individuals who are closer to nature are better able to recognize and exemplify goodness and spiritual discernment. Wordsworth espouses the common man and incidents from ordinary life as the appropriate subject for poetry. Romanticism places the individual at the center of life and experience, and this is very important. So simply here, Romanticism focuses on the primitive individuals. So the age of reason or the previous age focus on society, the group. But for romanticism, they focus on the individual, the person or the one. So that's the difference. The difference is that the emphasis on the individual and the person, the artist or the individual person, but not the group or the society. Okay. Lyrical ballads. Lyrical ballads, I think we explained it before. Uh, we talked about the lyrical ballads and why romantic period started in 1798. It is because the lyrical ballads published in at this age, and this is the time at this time and this is the time when the romantic period started. And let me read from the lyrical ballads here. Lyrical ballad is a collection of poems written and jointly published by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798. The volume is of such importance that it is in 1798 publication date is often considered the beginning of the Romantic period. The poetry in lyrical ballads marked a distinct change in both subject matter and style from the poetry of the 18th century. So simply, the lyrical ballads, is the declaration or the manifesto of the Romantic period. It is published at this date, and it shows the difference between the Romantic period and the period before, or the Age of Reason. Okay. Here are some examples from the lyrical ballads, so we can talk about them. In the 1801 edition of Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth include a preface, an introductory explanation to Lyrical Ballads to explain his theory of how poetry should be written. The following points from the preface delineates the characteristics that make these poems markedly different from poetry of the preceding century. And here's some definitions, for by William Wordsworth about what they mean by the by Romanticism. Here, one of them is the language of poetry should be the real language spoken by common people. So simply, they want to use a language used by common people, like the people who live in England. Unlike the Age of Reason, where they focus on the language of the educated people, the people of high rank, the era or the Romantic period, they focus on the people, the common people, the common man, the man who is a peasant, a shoemaker, a carpenter. Like these are the real common people. And that's why the Romantic poetry is very simple, and they use simple language compared to the Age of Reason, which they use a very highly sophisticated and educated language. During the 18th century, many poets used what Wordsworth called poetic diction, flowery, ornate words for ordinary things such as feathery flocks instead of birds or finery tribes instead of fish. So simply in the Age of Reason, or the 18th century here, the Age of Reason, they use a very sophisticated language. They use poetic dictions, means that they try to craft and make their poetry very difficult. So instead of using, they use flowery and ornate words of ordinary things, such as, instead of using the word birds, they use feathery flocks to make their poetry beautiful. This is rejected by Romanticism. They say, no, we should not accept this. Wordsworth protests that people do not use such expressions. Therefore, poetry shouldn't either. Notice also that much of Wordsworth's poetry rejects the uniform stanza and line length that were popular in the 18th century. Much of his poetry is free in form. And again, so Romantic poetry is free in form, lines and stanza of. Why it's free? Because it's democracy. Remember, we talked about democracy. And because of this democracy, that's why it's free. And second, the varying length in the same poem, more like the selection of language they use by them. So simply, their poetry is not something that is crafty and fixed. Like you have number of stanzas, number of lines, number of words, but their poetry is spontaneous, is inspirational, is free and democratic. The subject of poetry should be events from the real lives of the common people. Again, so here we have another explanation, another reference to the common people, not the rich people, not the people in the Greek and the Roman empires in the old past. They talk about the common people in England. Wordsworth believed that the common ordinary situations are worthy topics for the poems, events such as farmers blowing the fields. He further believes that through the imagination he could make his audience once more aware of the significance of the common scenes that they might otherwise take for granted. So here we have the word farmers here, which is very important. So now the topics of Romantic poets is not the king or the queen or anyone who's very important, but the topic here is the farmer. And then Wordsworth said, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. So this is the most important definition of Romantic poetry. Romantic poetry is a spontaneous. Spontaneous means that it comes out of your body or out of your head without preparation, and it's an overflow, so it means it flows without preparation. Like the Age of Reason, they prepare everything, they craft everything. But for Romantic poetry, all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So simply, the Romantic poems are just powerful feelings. that comes spontaneously out of you. Thus, words would identify sensibility rather than reason as the source of poetry. And finally, the poet is a man speaking to men, but an individual who's extraordinarily perceptive. So, man speaking to men, simply the poet is a man, right? And he's speaking to men. Like men here refers to the people, to the common people, to the regular people. So simply, when you read romantic poetry, you have the poet, the man, who is talking to other men's, and that's why in romantic poetry, the poems are very simple and uses common language that can be understood by everyone, and this is the heart of romanticism, and this is the heart of democracy. Okay. Now, forms of literature. We have the novel, and here's the definition for the novel as famously defined by Holman Harmon. Handbook to Literature is an extended fictional prose narratives. The novel flourished in the Romantic period, encompassing novels previously listed by Anne Bronte, Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, Mary Shelley, and Anna Radcliffe. Sir Walter Scott's historical novels, known as the Walter Waverley novel set in medieval time, glorifies Scottish nationalism, and Jane Austen's novel of manners, portraying the genteel country life of the Regency era. So here, there's the definition of the novel, and this is part, like in the Romantic period, we have different forms of literature. The first form is the novel, and here's the definition. The second is the lyrical poetry, and this is very important, the lyrical poetry. Why it's important? Because Romantic poets wrote the lyrical poetry, and remember the lyrical ballads, which declared the beginning of the Romantic period. A lyric is a brief poem expresses emotions, imaginations, and meditative thoughts, usually is in stanza form. And then we have the Romantic ode. As used in the Romantic period, the ode is a lyrical poem longer than usual lyrics and often a more serious topic, usually meditative and philosophic in tone and subject. And this is called the Romantic ode. And then we have the ballads. The ballads here, let me go to the next page, which is the last one. A ballad is a narrative poem. It means that like it's a poem, but it has a narrative. It's like a short story or a story. A narrative poem or song. Ballads originated as songs that were part of an oral culture, usually simple and regular in rhyme and rhythm. The typical ballad stanza is four-line rhyming A B A B. Because of their simplicity and their role as part of folk culture, the ballads were popular with many romantic writers. And why, now you ask yourself, why romantic writers, write in forms of ballads? Because ballads are, folk poetry. It means that it's a sort of folk, poems. And it means that they are written for the common people. And that's why romantic poets use ballads, because this is the way that they can connect with the common people, with the ordinary people, with the farmer, with the carpenter, with the shoemaker, with all these common people. They are not concerned with the great people, but they are concerned with the common people, and that's the definition of the ballad.